Hey photographers, you've got some shots. Maybe you took them for mood, maybe you took them for chasing shadows or something like that. You've got some kind of dark, moodier. Maybe you've already had been playing with your exposure compensation, so you have darker shots to begin with. Now in Lightroom, what are you going to do with them? All right, let's talk about that. So here's some shots we just took around during our shooting challenge for mood today, and I've got some interesting light and shadows, some close-ups of leaves and things like that. Now I'm going to kind of pour through these and see which ones to edit and how to edit them. Let's go back to this one. I really like this one with the reflection and the shadows. What can we do with this? Now, it looks pretty nice already. You know, it's darker shadows, deeper, kind of more saturated look with the exposure compensation. I think it was at -3. What I'm going to aim to do is play with my, oh, there's the bell, play with my editing palette here. Okay, so here I am in the slider here, which is my edit window. I've got one image there, so I'm going to start to play with this. Now, a couple things I'm going to do. The name of the game here was shadows. I really like those dark shadows. So with blacks, I can deepen those blacks. Watch, I bring that slider down, and already some of those dark blacks are becoming more rich. Same thing you can do with shadows specifically. It targets specifically the shadows in that area, so you can kind of, it's called crushing your blacks. Okay, so you can pull that down, so you can play with that a little bit. Here, the curve, I'm a big fan of this curve, so you can play with this curve. If I'm going to bring it here, it's going to brighten, which is not the mood I'm looking for, right? This is kind of more back to the original exposure because it was actually quite bright out. So I'm going to keep it on the darker end of things, but I can also play with this, and so I can increase the contrast by pulling up a little bit on the top of this and clicking here and pulling a node down, so it's even more, it's a gentle S curve. Okay, so that S curve will add that level of contrast to the element, and you can kind of play with refining that as well. All right, in terms of the some of these here, right, you can play with your saturation if you want to kind of have that desaturated look. If it's too intense, you're trying to get that kind of washed out Edo Zolo kind of look, you can desaturate it a little bit. Not black and white, but desaturate it a little bit. All right, so now my blues aren't quite as intense. It's more somber, more gray. So that's another thing you can play with. Now, if you were chasing shadows on the weekend and you have leaves and bright leaves and things like that, maybe you don't want to do that, but sometimes that saturation can be a good choice to try it with. Another thing you can play with is the vignette, right? So you're aiming for a vignette. The vignette, if I crank this, you can see it creates like that darker edges, right? So that's obviously way too overdone, but you can be subtle about it if you wanted to bring your attention to the center of the image a little bit. Okay, that kind of frames it a little bit with the darkness. All right, let's go to a different image here. Okay, so here I've got just kind of like on the ground some autumn leaves that were happening. I love the texture, right? I might like amplify the texture of this, right? So you can see it's sharpening and become more crisp and clear, bringing the clarity up too. So here in the foreground, some of those those details, the maple keys and the leaves, are getting more crisp and clear. All right, if I go back up here, I'm going to take my shadows and drop my shadows. I want those deep blacks, and maybe drop it here as well. Okay, if you find it isn't quite as dark as you were hoping, maybe you were only shooting this at -1, but it's a good shot, you wanted to drop the overall exposure for mood, here's that slider up at the top here, right? So I can pull it down so it's a little bit more dark. It feels like I took it at a different time of day all of a sudden, right? The exposure is lower, the shadows are lower, feels like a shot taken later in the day. Again, slider, I can be pulling a gentle S curve to make that more dramatic as shot. Okay, and then in terms of color, maybe you want this one to actually be a bit more vibrant because you love the autumn leaves, the autumn colors. So in this one, you don't want to saturate it. Maybe you want the opposite. You want to bring up the vibrance, maybe bring up the saturation a little bit too, so we're getting those deep oranges. Just like that. All right, let's take a look at some other shots. Here, I've got this one. This is the skate park. I was focusing on these ramps and the cool shadows on the ramps. Now, the backgrounds I find a little distracting, so I might go here into my crop, keep the aspect ratio to the original photo, so I'm not messing with the aspect ratio, but I might bring it down to something tighter, right? So it's more focused, less on the background, more on these like abstract shapes created by the light and the shadow with these berms and ramps. Okay, so I'm going to double click on that. That's kind of more interesting to me already, right? So more focus on those shadows and bringing the shadows down, darkening those shadows is looking pretty good. But this might be a good candidate to turn into black and white. So up at the very top of my edit window, I've got this black and white button. I might choose to go into monochrome and do the edit from there, because sometimes you'll find maybe it is more suited that way. See what happens? The distracting elements in the background just fade out into dark, and these abstract shapes become a lot more interesting, a lot more clear. Here, when you go into the black and white, you can change the black and white mixer somewhat. So say the oranges, if I want to deepen the oranges, it had a kind of a warm tinge to the ramp. If I'm darkening those ones specifically, you can play with how it turns into black and white. You might remember that from stalkers and things like that. Again, clarity if you want, texture to bring up, especially if there's some texture in the concrete of the vase. So there's option number 3, is adding the mood, turning it into black and white. So give those a try. Those are all in the editing window, maybe in the crop window should you need to crop out some distracting elements. That's what you're aiming for. Deeper shadows, playing with that mood, and amplifying what you already